Russia didn't send troops across the border. It didn't issue threats on state television. It didn't stage a referendum. Instead, it turned the valve. The same valve it's turned for 30 years. Gas, leverage, winter. On January 1st, 2025, at exactly 7:50 p.m. Chișinău time, Gazprom cut the flow. The pipelines went silent. Transnistria went dark. And across mainland Moldova, energy prices spiked immediately. This was the move Moscow had been telegraphing for months. The pressure Moscow thought would work like it always had, but something didn't break the way Russia expected. The lights stayed on in Chișinău. The government didn't panic. The protests Russia was counting on didn't materialize fast enough. And 9 months later, in September 2025, Moldova's pro-European government won re-election with a clear majority. That outcome wasn't supposed to happen, because when you understand how Russia applies pressure to small states, you understand that timing is everything. You cut energy in winter, you spike prices before election, you create a window where decisions must be made before help can arrive. That window is where leverage lives, and for decades, Moldova existed inside that window, until it didn't. The reason sits 90 kilometers west of Chișinău, Romania, not threatening, not invading, just quietly dismantling the conditions that made Russian pressure work in the first place. And once those conditions disappear, Russia's entire regional strategy starts to collapse. If you want sharp, fact-driven breakdowns of how power really moves in Europe, subscribe now. No hype, just mechanics. Now here's where Moscow's problem actually begins. For most of its existence as an independent state, Moldova was never designed to say no to Russia. It was designed to absorb pressure and comply. Moldova is small, barely 2.6 million people, no significant military, outside NATO, outside the EU, until recently. And for years, it ran almost entirely on Russian gas piped through Ukraine or Transnistria. This made Moldova textbook vulnerable. You didn't need to threaten invasion. You just needed to adjust the flow rate and wait. Gas prices rise, heating becomes expensive, winter closes in, public anger grows, political coalitions fracture, governments lose support. Russia has used this exact sequence across Eastern Europe for decades. In Moldova, it worked repeatedly. The formula was reliable because it didn't depend on tanks. It depended on dependence. Energy wasn't just infrastructure, it was a political instrument. Every price hike was a message. Every supply disruption was a reminder. Every winter was a negotiation that Moldova entered from a position of weakness. This is why Moldova mattered to Moscow. Not because it was powerful, because it was manageable. And then there was Transnistria, a sliver of land east of the Dniester River, frozen in 1992, hosting 1,500 Russian troops and 22,000 tons of Soviet-era ammunition at Kabasna. Transnistria was never meant to escalate. It was meant to sit there, reminding everyone that escalation was possible. From Moscow's perspective, this setup was elegant, low cost, low visibility, high control, until January 2025, when Russia pulled the lever and Moldova didn't collapse. Let's be precise about what happened. On December 31st, 2024, Russia's gas transit contract with Ukraine expired. Gazprom could have routed gas to Transnistria through alternative pipelines like Turkstream. It chose not to. The cut was deliberate. The timing was intentional. Winter. Elections approaching. Maximum pressure. Moldova had declared an energy state of emergency 2 weeks earlier on December 16th. The government knew what was coming. Transnistria, which depended entirely on Russian gas for electricity generation, was hit hardest. Factories shut down, heating disappeared, rolling blackouts began. Mainland Moldova faced sharply higher electricity prices as the cheap power from Transnistria's gas-fired plant vanished. This was the window, the moment where panic was supposed to spread faster than solutions could arrive. But the power kept flowing. Emergency electricity imports came through Romania. The European Union announced a $250 million support package by early February. By June, the EU was openly targeting the end of 2026 to fully decouple Moldova from Russian energy supplies. The crisis didn't spiral. it stabilized. And in September 2025, Moldova held parliamentary elections. Russia had bet that energy pain would turn voters against President Maia Sandu's pro-European government. It didn't. The Party of Action and Solidarity won 50.2% of the vote and retained its parliamentary majority with 55 seats. The pro-Russian opposition captured just 24.2%. The margin wasn't close, the outcome wasn't ambiguous, and the decisive factor was the diaspora vote, which broke 78.6% for the pro-European side. Russia's pressure didn't fail because Moldova resisted. It failed because Moldova had time to absorb the shock, time to secure alternatives, time to hold elections without collapsing first. And that time came from one place, Romania. Here's what makes Romania different from every other neighbor Moldova has ever had. Romania doesn't just share a border, it shares a language, it shares culture, and critically, it shares infrastructure. But more than any of that, Romania sits inside two systems Russia cannot touch: the European Union and NATO. That changes everything about how fast help can move. Energy support doesn't need to cross Poland and Ukraine. It crosses 90 kilometers. Diplomatic coordination doesn't take weeks of European Council meetings. It happens directly, government to government, often within hours. Financial aid doesn't wait for crisis summits. It flows through pre-existing trade and banking channel. This is the part Moscow didn't plan for. Russia's pressure model assumes delay. It assumes that small states panic before Europe organizes. It assumes the window stays open long enough for leverage to bite. Romania closes that window. When Gazprom cut gas on January 1st, 2025, Romania didn't wait for Brussels to convene. Electricity imports began immediately through the Isaxia-Vulcanești interconnection line, the only high-voltage link between the two countries at the time. That line, part of the EU-backed Romania-Moldova-Ukraine interconnector project, kept Moldova's grid stable when Transnistria's power plant went offline. But Romania wasn't just reacting. It was already building redundancy. By February 2025, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development approved $15.4 million in grants and $30.8 million in loans for a second major interconnection: a 400 kilovolt power line linking Balti in northern Moldova to Suceava in Romania. The European Investment Bank matched the loan. Total project cost, $77 million. Target completion, late 2026. This isn't emergency aid. This is structural integration. Once that second line is operational, Moldova will have two separate routes for electricity imports from Europe. Gazprom's ability to create energy crises through supply cuts effectively ends, and Romania went further. In October 2024, before the gas cut even happened, Romanian and Moldovan energy regulators launched a market coupling project to fully integrate their electricity markets. This allows automatic, price-based energy trading without manual approvals. It makes energy flow like water finding its level. When Moldova needs power, it pulls. When Romania has surplus, it flows. No political decisions required, no leverage points to exploit. Russia's pressure strategy depends on creating singular moments of vulnerability. Romania is systematically eliminating those moments. But energy is only one layer. Romania is Moldova's largest trade partner. Free trade agreements eliminated tariffs years ago. Romanian banks operate across Moldova. Romanian companies invest in logistics, retail, agriculture. Hundreds of thousands of Moldovan workers live and work in Romania, sending remittances that stabilize the economy even when domestic conditions worsen. This creates redundancy at every level. When one economic channel is pressured, another compensates. When one sector slows, another absorbs the shock. Russia's influence model depends on controlling single points of failure. Romania removes them. And there's a security dimension that Moscow cannot ignore. Romania is a NATO member. Moldova is not. But cooperation doesn't require membership. Border security, intelligence sharing, training, crisis coordination, None of this violates Moldova's constitutional neutrality, but all of it raises the cost of destabilization. When Moldova coordinates with Romania, any Russian interference attempt risks touching NATO indirectly, and that shadow is enough to make Moscow cautious. Here's the bottom line. Romania isn't confronting Russia. It's doing something far more effective. It's breaking Russia's timing. And once timing breaks, pressure stops working. For 30 years, Transnistria was Russia's insurance policy in Moldova, a frozen conflict, a military presence, a reminder that escalation was always available if pressure elsewhere failed. Transnistria worked because Moldova was weak. As long as Chișinău was one energy cutoff away from collapse, Transnistria didn't need to do anything. Its value came from existing. But that value depended on one assumption, that Moldova would always remain isolated and fragile. That assumption just broke. The moment Romania began absorbing Moldova's shocks, Transnistria stopped being leverage and started being a burden. Here's why. Transnistria is not self-sufficient. It relied on subsidized Russian gas to generate electricity, which it sold to mainland Moldova at low prices. That arrangement gave Transnistria economic relevance and gave Russia a way to keep mainland Moldova dependent. When Gazprom cut gas on January 1st, 2025, Transnistria's power plant shut down. Factories closed. Heating stopped. The local economy ground to a halt. Transnistria, not mainland Moldova, felt the worst of the crisis. This flipped the logic. Instead of Transnistria anchoring Russian influence inside Moldova, Moldova's stabilization isolated Transnistria from its surroundings. And then, Ukraine and Moldova sealed it off entirely. On January 1st, 2026, exactly 1 year after the gas cutoff, Ukraine and Moldova implemented a joint blockade around Transnistria. Ukraine tightened controls along its 450-kilometer border with the region. Moldova expanded checkpoints and mobile patrols. Airspace restrictions were enforced. All movement of people, goods, fuel, and equipment now requires approval from both governments. The 1,500 Russian troops stationed in Transnistria, 70 to 100 actual Russian officers, the rest local recruits, are now cut off from fuel, ammunition, and regular supply rotations. The informal logistics channels they used for years have been eliminated. Transnistria has no maritime access. Airlifts are impossible because Moldova controls the airspace. Land routes are blocked. Russia's military presence in Transnistria is now geographically isolated, logistically unsustainable, and strategically useless. As of mid-January 2026, Moscow has issued no formal response, no threats, no ultimatums, no escalation. Why? Because any move involving Transnistria now risks wider entanglement. Moldova isn't acting alone. It's acting in coordination with Ukraine, with EU backing, with Romanian support in the background. There's no chaos to exploit, no vacuum to fill, no invitation to intervene. Frozen conflicts only work when the surrounding state is unstable. Once stability sets in, the freeze stops serving Moscow's interests. Transnistria has become a problem Russia has to manage, not a tool it can exploit. Romania didn't neutralize Transnistria by force. It neutralized it by making Moldova stable enough that Transnistria lost its strategic purpose. And that brings us to the final layer. Russia has always been comfortable pressuring weak states. That's the playbook. You apply energy pressure, you stir instability, you lean on frozen conflicts, you wait for the crack. What Romania is doing breaks that playbook entirely, because Romania isn't treating Moldova like a front line. It's treating it like infrastructure. And that difference is everything. For most of its post-Soviet history, Moldova existed in a gray zone, not fully aligned with Russia, not fully integrated with Europe, politically fragile, economically vulnerable, constantly exposed to pressure from multiple directions. Gray zones are where Russian escalation works best. They're slow to react, divided internally, uncertain who will step in when things go wrong. Romania's strategy is to eliminate the gray zone entirely. not through annexation, not through military guarantees, but by quietly plugging Moldova into systems that already function. Energy grids, trade networks, financial systems, legal frameworks, security cooperation. Moldova opened EU accession negotiations in June 2024. By mid-2025, the European Commission announced that all negotiating clusters could open by the end of the year. The technical screening process was completed ahead of schedule. EU officials now consider late 2027 a feasible target for concluding negotiations. That timeline is unprecedented. It's 2 to 3 times faster than any previous candidate. Why? Because Moldova isn't starting from scratch. It's already integrated with Romania across multiple dimensions: regulatory alignment, customs procedures, border management, anti-corruption frameworks. These changes don't make headlines, but they're irreversible once embedded. Every reform reduces the space where Russian influence traditionally operates. Opaque institutions, informal power structures, personal leverage over decision makers. As Moldova becomes more rule-bound, Russian pressure loses traction. You can't coerce what no longer responds to backroom deals. Here's the deeper problem for Moscow. Moldova is no longer being treated as a prize to be won or lost. It's being treated as a process, a long, methodical integration into European systems. There's no single moment to disrupt, no decisive election to hijack, no singular dependency to exploit. Pressure doesn't collapse the system, it tests it, and the system holds. That changes Moscow's calculation entirely. Instead of asking, how do we push Moldova? The question becomes, how much does pushing Moldova now cost us? And the answer keeps rising. Romania's approach isn't confrontational. It doesn't threaten Russia. It doesn't challenge Moscow directly. It simply removes the conditions that made Russian pressure effective. When pressure no longer produces results, escalation becomes risky. Because escalation without leverage is just exposure. This is why Romania is becoming Russia's biggest obstacle in Moldova. Not because it's loud, not because it's aggressive, but because it's methodical. It's turning Moldova from a vulnerable state into a functioning system. And systems are very hard to coerce. Russia didn't lose Moldova in a single dramatic moment. There was no invasion repelled, no ultimatum rejected, no decisive battle. Russia lost Moldova slowly, mechanically, through a process that rendered its favorite tools obsolete. Energy pressure stopped working when alternative routes opened. Transnistria stopped being leveraged when Moldova stabilized. Political interference failed when elections went ahead anyway, and voters chose Europe. Each of these failures traces back to the same source: Romania. Not through confrontation, through integration, not through threats, through infrastructure, not through drama, through consistency. And once a small state is no longer small, once it's part of something larger, pressure doesn't work anymore. That's the lesson Moscow is learning in Moldova. And it's a lesson that changes how power works across Eastern Europe. Because if pressure fails in Moldova, where else does it fail next?